Imagine walking through a bustling airport where people are rushing to catch flights, hugging loved ones goodbye, or eagerly awaiting reunions. Amidst the chaos, there's a lone, elderly man sitting quietly in the corner, clutching a small, worn-out suitcase. At first glance, he seems like just another traveler, but as the hours turn into days, it becomes clear that his story is far from ordinary. Airport security starts to notice him. Day after day, he's there watching the crowds, but never boarding a plane. He doesn't complain or cause trouble, but his presence raises questions. Why is he here? What is he waiting for? As they approach him to investigate, they uncover something far more heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. Stay tuned as we unravel the mystery behind this man's heartbreaking wait. What could have kept him at the airport for 3 long days? And what did security find that changed everything? You won't believe what happens next. The elderly man had been sitting in the same spot for nearly 3 days. His eyes, though tired, never seemed to drift from the rows of travelers rushing by. He wasn't a fixture of the terminal like a bench or a vending machine. No, he was a figure, an enigma that slowly started to capture the attention of those who passed by, even if just for a fleeting moment. Some people noticed him, raised an eyebrow, and quickly continued on their way, while others couldn't help but wonder about the man's quiet solitude. Airport security, ever watchful, had been keeping tabs on him for a while. At first, he was just a curiosity, an elderly traveler who seemed to have missed his flight or perhaps had lost track of time. But as the days dragged on, it became impossible to ignore the fact that something wasn't right. A man of his age, sitting alone for days in a busy airport, was not typical. They had seen him interact with no one, and his belongings didn't suggest he was preparing to leave anytime soon. They had to find out more. A security officer, who had noticed the man's silent presence from the very beginning, finally decided to approach him. She had no idea what she was walking into. She did not expect to find herself unraveling a story that would stay with her long after her shift ended. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice gentle but firm. "Are you all right? Can I help you with something?" The man didn't respond right away. He simply looked up at her with tired, clouded eyes. His face was lined with wrinkles, his gray hair a bit disheveled. He didn't seem startled or confused, he just appeared lost. After a long pause, he spoke. "I'm waiting," he said, his voice weak but steady. "I'm waiting for my flight." The officer, a bit confused, looked around. There were no signs of a ticket or a luggage tag. She gestured toward his small suitcase, which was sitting untouched at his feet. "I don't see a boarding pass, sir," she said, her concern deepening. "Do you know when your flight is? Is it delayed?" The man slowly shook his head. "I'm not flying anywhere," he said quietly, his eyes falling to the floor. "I'm waiting for someone." The officer felt a shiver of unease. She could tell he wasn't making much sense, but his story didn't seem to be the one of a lost or confused traveler. There was something deliberate in his calm demeanor, something that made her believe this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. Still, there was a larger question hanging in the air. Who was he waiting for, and why? Over the next few hours, security continued to check in on the elderly man, each time trying to piece together more of his story. They asked him questions, offered assistance, and tried to comfort him. But he would only say the same thing, "I'm waiting." It was maddening. He never mentioned a name, never provided any details. His story remained locked behind the same cold exterior. Meanwhile, other airport staff began to notice the man too. Some had sympathy for him, while others grew impatient. One particularly seasoned flight attendant was convinced that the elderly man was simply suffering from some sort of mental confusion. She suggested calling an ambulance or social services. But there was something about the way the man sat there patient and unflinching that made everyone hesitate. And then the night came. The terminal grew quieter and the crowd thinned out. The elderly man hadn't moved, as usual, except to sip water from a plastic cup or shuffle through the contents of his bag, which appeared to contain nothing more than old papers and a few coins. When security came to check on him one last time that evening, They noticed something they hadn't seen before, a small, weathered photograph tucked into his bag. One of the officers, intrigued, carefully examined the photo. It was a picture of a woman, her face smiling in a way that radiated warmth. She looked young, younger than the man, and the picture was old, faded with time. But there was something about it, something that made the officer's gut twist with uncertainty. Was this the person he had been waiting for? "Sir," the officer called softly, not wanting to startle him. "Can you tell us about the woman in this picture?" The man's eyes flickered with recognition. For the first time in days, he looked up, his gaze focused on the photo. He took it in his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "She was supposed to come back," he said, his words so quiet that the officer had to lean in closer. "She promised she'd come back. We were supposed to meet here. At this airport. She was going to fly home. But she never made it." The officer's heart skipped a beat. This was no ordinary wait. This wasn't the story of a man simply missing a flight. This was a man caught in a memory that had never fully let go. And it seemed that memory was dragging him through the days, waiting in the exact place where he was supposed to be reunited with someone he hadn't seen in years. But why? What had happened? What was he waiting for, really? As the officer tried to process what she had just heard, the man looked back at her, his eyes clouded with grief and longing. Her name was. He trailed off, his voice breaking. He didn't finish the sentence. His eyes fluttered closed as though the weight of it all was too much to bear. In the distance, a flight was being announced over the loudspeakers, the voice echoing through the nearly empty terminal. "Flight 102, now boarding 4. The officer couldn't help but glance toward the gate, where travelers were starting to form a line. But then she looked back at the elderly man. He hadn't moved. "I was supposed to meet her here," he murmured again, as though the words had become a mantra, something he repeated over and over in the hope that it might make sense. And just as the officer was about to ask him more, something strange happened. The lights flickered briefly, and the man's face, usually so composed, twisted with a faint flicker of panic. He shot up from his seat and rushed toward the exit doors, his hands gripping his suitcase tightly. The officer sprang to her feet, calling after him. "Sir, wait! Where are you going?" But he didn't stop. He moved faster now, his gait unsteady but urgent. "What's happening?" the officer muttered to herself. Why was he so desperate now? Where was he going? The man disappeared through the exit doors, vanishing into the night. The officer stood frozen, the photograph still in her hands, and felt the weight of the mystery press down harder than ever. What had she just witnessed? What was the truth behind the elderly man's quiet, heartbreaking wait? And what was waiting for him beyond the doors of the airport? The answers seemed just out of reach, and as the officer stood there, she couldn't help but wonder this was only the beginning of a story much darker and more complex than anyone could have imagined. The sound of the airport doors slamming shut echoed through the terminal as the elderly man disappeared into the night. The officer stood frozen for a moment, staring at the empty space where he had been. The photo still clutched tightly in her hand, its faded edges worn smooth by years of handling. Her mind raced. Something didn't feel right. Her instincts told her that the man hadn't just been waiting for a flight. No, this was far deeper, far more painful than simply missing a plane. But what was it? She rushed toward the exit, following his steps into the darkened parking lot. The cold night air hit her face as she scanned the area, the dim glow of the terminal lights casting long shadows across the tarmac. There was no sign of him. No figure shuffling between the cars, no faint whisper of movement. He had vanished. Frustration and concern churned in her chest. She had to know more. She had to find him. The story he had shared, the faint memory of a woman, a promise to return, nagged at her. It didn't feel like something that could be dismissed. This man had lived through something, and whatever it was, it had led him to this moment. The question was, what had he lost? The officer walked back into the terminal, determined to find an answer. She quickly flagged down a few of the airport staff members who had interacted with the elderly man over the past days. The ones who had seen him in the same spot, day in and day out. They all remembered him, of course. Some had even tried to help him, offering assistance, suggesting he call someone for help. But the man had never been receptive to any of their efforts. He'd always politely refused, with that same quiet, patient smile. There was something about his demeanor that didn't seem typical of a lost traveler. And now, his sudden disappearance raised new questions. One of the security officers mentioned that he had been talking to a flight attendant earlier that day, a woman who had tried to comfort him, but had found little success. She was at the gate when the man disappeared, her eyes wide with confusion, as she saw him rush toward the exit. It seemed odd. Why hadn't she noticed anything unusual? Why hadn't anyone else seen the desperation in his eyes when he left? Determined to piece it together, the officer pulled up surveillance footage from the past few days. As she watched the grainy video, she saw the elderly man in the corner, sitting silently, reading a newspaper, staring at the clock, and staring at the entrance as if waiting for someone to walk through those doors. In the footage, he didn't speak much to anyone. But in his movements, she saw something. He was always watching. Always waiting. And then, there was the moment when his eyes met the photo he'd been clutching. It was brief, but it was as if the image was calling him, pulling him out of his seat. In the footage from just a few moments before he bolted toward the exit, she could see the exact moment when his whole demeanor shifted. It wasn't panic. It wasn't madness. It was a kind of resolve. Like he had just remembered something important. Something that had been gnawing at him for years. She replayed the clip again and again, but she still didn't have all the answers. The man's disappearance wasn't some sudden, impulsive action. It felt calculated. And when he vanished into the parking lot, it felt like something bigger than just a chance escape. That's when it hit her, the woman in the photo. She had to be the key. The officer rushed to the security desk and asked for help. She had to track down that photo. She needed to know who the woman was, where she had gone, and why she had promised to return but never had. The photograph was too significant. It was too meaningful. There had to be a story there. It didn't take long to pull up some details. The photograph had been taken in the 1980s, based on the style of clothing and the type of film used. That was something the officer had noticed immediately. The photo was too old to be from recent years. But that didn't narrow down the mystery. There were no names or dates on the back. There was no obvious clue about where or when it had been taken. The man had spoken of a promise, a reunion, but what had really happened? Who was this woman, and why had she not returned? The officer decided to follow the thread. She reached out to local hospitals, shelters, and social services to see if there had been any reports of a woman matching the description from the photo. After hours of searching, a name finally surfaced. A woman had gone missing years ago, just a few months before the man had started coming to the airport. She had disappeared without a trace. It was a small connection, just a name and a missing persons report, but it was enough to push the investigation forward. The officer dug deeper into the woman's background. She had been a frequent flyer, someone who had traveled internationally for work. Her last known flight had been canceled due to a mechanical issue, which had delayed her return for several days. She was supposed to be coming back on that flight, the one where she had promised to meet the elderly man. As the officer learned more, she realized that the man wasn't simply waiting for a delayed return. No, the story was more tragic than that. The woman had been on a flight that had met with an accident shortly after takeoff. It wasn't widely reported at the time, as it had been a small private plane with only a few passengers. The wreckage had been found in a remote area, and only the woman's personal items were recovered. No bodies had been found, though officials had declared her missing, presumed dead. The elderly man had never learned the truth. He had spent years believing that the woman he had loved had simply failed to return. He believed that one day she would walk through the doors of the airport as promised. And so, every day, he returned, waiting, hoping, believing she would come back. The officer stood frozen in shock, her heart heavy with the realization of what had really happened. This wasn't just a simple case of a man waiting for a flight, it was a story of loss, of unfulfilled promises, and of a love that had never been given closure. She sat down at her desk, holding the photo in her hands. The photo that had started it all. The photograph of a woman who had made a promise that had gone unfulfilled. The next morning, she revisited the elderly man's story, and with it, the weight of the unresolved grief he carried with him. She knew she couldn't undo the pain he had suffered. But she could give him closure. She could tell him the truth that no one had dared to speak until now. A few days later, she found him again. The elderly man was sitting in the same spot, as though he had never left. But this time, he wasn't clutching the photo. Instead, he was holding a letter in his hands. She approached him, careful not to startle him. "Sir," she began softly, "I found something. Something about the woman in your photo." His eyes flickered, a mix of hope and hesitation. "I know," he said, his voice soft. "I know she's gone. I've known for a while." The officer blinked, taken aback. "But how?" He looked at her, his expression a mix of resignation and acceptance. "I've been waiting because I needed to know. I needed to know that she had a chance to come back. But now, I see. Now I know that she won't." For the first time in days, he smiled, sad, bittersweet, but at peace. And with that smile, he finally let go.